Hey, it's Travis. I wanted to take this moment to discuss our sponsor, BetterHelp. I used to think talking to a therapist was a sign of weakness, until I started talking to one. It has really helped me limit the negative chatter that can infiltrate my brain. Therapy has helped me become a more insightful person, father, and husband. That's why I'm excited to tell you about BetterHelp. Their online platform makes finding a therapist incredibly easy. Fill out a brief questionnaire and you will be matched with a therapist in just a few days. Go to betterhelp.com/thank you notes, betterhelp.com/thank you notes, or click the link in my show notes. In doing so, you will be helping this show and you will receive 10% off your first month. If you aren't clicking with your therapist, if you're not getting a good vibe, BetterHelp will allow you to switch your therapist at any time with no additional cost. Online therapy is a game changer for me. I have such an erratic schedule. I work nights, weekends, late, early, holidays, you name it. Being able to video call my therapist from my phone in a call room, at work, or in my car, or whatever, it's extremely convenient for me, and it allows me the time and the place to actually get my therapy in. So if you're struggling, if you need to talk to somebody, go to betterhelp.com/thank you notes and they'll get you set up with somebody. This has been my thank you note to BetterHelp for supporting this show. Welcome to the Thank You Notes podcast. My name is Travis McVeigh. I'm an anesthesiologist from Dallas, Texas, and I love thank you notes so much, I decided to make them into a podcast. My guest today is Nancy Davis Coe. While doing some research for the show, I came across her book, The Thank You Project, Cultivating Happiness One Letter of Gratitude at a Time. She wrote one thank you note per week for an entire year. She learned some lessons and had some pretty great insights, and she shares them in the book. It's a really good book. I hope you pick it up and check it out yourself. In addition to being an author, she's also a podcaster. She hosted a podcast called the Midlife Mixtape Podcast, which was featured in the Wall Street Journal. She's a real pro, and I stepped up my professionalism for the occasion, so let's get to my talk with author and podcaster, Nancy Davis Coe. All right, welcome to the Thank You Notes podcast. I'm joined by esteemed author Nancy Davis Coe. Nancy, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me. It's so nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you too. I'm going to go through your bio. You have had writing featured in the Washington Post, Huffington Post, the San Francisco Chronicle, on NPR, and you hosted a podcast called the Midlife Mixtape that was featured in the Wall Street Journal as one of the 8 best podcasts for facing retirement, and also won the prestigious Iris Award. Did I leave anything out?
I wrote a book called The Thank You Project. That's which I know we'll be talking about today. So
that's the chain that links us. And you wrote a book in 2019 called The Thank You Project, Cultivating Happiness One Letter of Gratitude at a Time. I'm going to read a quote. It says, "It turns out the restorative power of deliberate gratitude, the delight that comes from knowing you will make someone's day when they read your words, the recognition that you, yes, you, are supported and loved as you make your way through the challenges of the world is a heady tonic."
I remember writing that and experiencing it. And I love that you're doing this podcast because when we connected, I said, I think the more ways people hear about this, the better. And the more times they hear about it, the better, because it's so easy to lose sight of why it makes sense to have a gratitude practice. What are the benefits to you and to the other person? And so I'm all for all the partners in gratitude.
Very good. So just a side note for the readers. So this book is about when Nancy turned 50, she made a decision that she was going to write 50 thank you notes that year, one every week. And the book details all of the different categories of people that she wrote them to, people, places, deceased authors, family, friends, and eventually to herself. And she found some interesting science and some interesting things about herself on the way. The first question I wanted to ask you, were you always a thank you note writer? Was this something that got hammered into you as a kid?
I was not a person with some kind of pre-existing gratitude practice. I did write thank you notes as a kid because my parents were, raised us that way, and I'm glad they did. And I raised my 2 daughters to do the same. But I was not somebody who kept a gratitude journal or anything like that. And so I was shocked and surprised to find out how effective writing, a weekly thank you letter was in really changing the way that I looked at the world around me, and in a permanent way, because I'm well past 50 now, and I'm still a much more resilient person, a much more optimistic person, and I trace it back to writing these letters back that was 2016 is when I was doing it. That was my kind of big benchmark birthday, and I just thought, "Oh, I should do something to make this year different. I should make it stand out." It felt weighty to be celebrating a half century. So I've been very fortunate. I've been very lucky in my life, and at that point my parents were still alive. I've been married at that point with my husband 25 years. We've got our girls were healthy, and I thought I don't want to take any of this for granted. I'm just going to do these letters once a week and think about the people I've crossed paths with who have helped, shaped, or inspired me. And I just kept coming back to that rubric. Have you helped, shaped, or inspired me? Then I owe you a letter. And that was how I got started. Didn't have a lot of expectations going into it. It was just kind of a thing I was going to do. I wasn't talking about it to anybody. I was just writing my little letters and sending them off.
You mentioned in the book and in interviews that I've seen with you that the best way to do a thank you note is to make it extremely personal. And the quote I have from you is, it doesn't need to win a Pulitzer. It just needs to sound like you. So what does a Nancy Davis Coe thank you note sound like?
I don't think I can answer that question. I thought that was because I don't know what I sound like. I know that I am somebody who, as a writer, and I happen to be a writer, but you do not have to be a writer to do thank you notes. And I think you're finding that as well, I hope. But I mean, anybody can do this. I'm a third kid. I grew up in a very funny family, so I try to infuse everything I write with some humor. We're all just a collection of our influences, right? So I'm sure my friends, yeah, I mean, I hope they thought that the letters sounded like me, because I don't really I mean, I do know how, as a writer, again, I do know how to write in other voices. I've written some fiction, I've written, different kinds of work, but these letters were me talking. That's how I would put it. This is how I communicate with these folks in person when I talk to them.
And that's something else that I noticed. It could, because there was a distinct difference in, take for example, your letter to Jane Austen and the excerpts that you posted from the letters to your friends. You talked to those people differently, and even the letters that you wrote to Rochester and like places.
Well, let's start with the Jane Austen letter. So your readers are probably like, why the heck did she write to a long dead British author? And I'll just give a little backstory on that, which is that I started the letters obviously to my closest people. I started with my mom and dad and my siblings and my family and my, best friends and all that. But what's really interesting, I mean, you mentioned the science, and when I wrote this book, when I got the contract to write the book, I said to the editor, I really want to include brain science in it because I want to understand how it worked. I know it worked. I know that I felt better every single time I wrote a letter. I know that I was always looking forward to writing the next one. What exactly was happening there? And so what I learned in researching, and I try to include this as much as possible in the book without it becoming a science book, but uh, we're all born with negative and positive recall bias. So everybody has the ability to focus on negative things. And that's important because you have to look out for, runaway cars and tidal waves and other things that would imperil you. And those initiate your fight or flight mechanism. What is it? Fight, flight, fawn, or freeze? I think now it's evolved, but it initiates this action in you. And it's important. We all have it and we need it. But what's troublesome is when you get stuck there and all you do every day is walk out the door and look for what's bad, what's scary, what's threatening, what's on Twitter. You can really very easily get sucked down this hole of everything's bad. And so what researchers have found out is that the best way to mitigate that is not by denying that it exists. There are bad, scary, threatening things out there, but it's to cultivate your positive recall bias, which is simply the inverse of that, and the ability or the choice, I would kind of characterize it as a choice to look around and notice what's good, who's helping me, who's doing good things for other people, who's inspiring me. And so these letters, just the process of writing a weekly letter forced me every week to think of somebody who I was going to write to, somebody who had helped shaped or inspired me. How did they do it? What were the times that they inspired me? What is it about them that has impacted me so much? And so I was constantly forcing myself into positive recall bias because I was trying to figure out why I wanted to write this personal letter. And over time, it kept getting easier and easier. And at some point, it occurred to me that I would get this really wonderful feeling finishing the letter. I used to write my letters on Friday afternoons, like 5 o'clock before the weekend started. And I would finish writing it, and I typed mine on a computer because my handwriting is illegible. But I would, type "Love Nancy" on the note, and I would just feel this sense of, like release and just connection and warmth. And it occurred to me, it was always nice when someone got a letter and said to me, "Thank you so much for that," or "That really meant a lot to me." Whatever they said, the reaction was always really wonderful, but it was secondary. The real juice came from writing the letter. And so at some point I was like, oh, so I could write the letter and get all these great benefits of a gratitude practice, but not mail it to somebody. Their reaction really doesn't matter that much, or it matters, but that's not the only thing that matters. So then I was like, oh, I could write to cities that I've lived in that have shaped me. I could write to authors who I love, because I've been a big reader since I could turn a page. And that is why I ended up writing a letter to Jane Austen. And that one does sound different because, Travis, it occurred to me, anything I would say to her would require a little explanation. If Jane Austen could read this letter, she was going to have to understand why I was typing on a computer and why, why I had like all these different things that as I was writing the letter, I was kind of cracking myself up because I'm like, well, I better tell her what this means or write it in a way that she'd understand. So that one was a little artful. That one was a little bit different from all the others, but I had fun with it. Whatever. I mean, the readers may think differently, but to me that was funny. But yeah, we are different people when we interact with others. I might talk to my sister in a way that's different from how I even talk to my brother. I'm close with both of them, but we all have different relationships. And so I imagine if you really dug into the minutia, all of them sound a little bit different because each of those relationships is slightly different.
What struck me while you were talking is there's a psychologist named Martin Seligman, and you quoted some of his papers in your book, and I've been emailing with him back and forth. And his whole thing with authentic happiness and learned optimism is that you actually have to get into an argument with yourself. You have to provide evidence when you get into a funk and a negative shame spiral that no, things aren't this bad because I'm this and this, and I have all these positive things that I can go to. And I think that's what these thank you notes have become, is that if you do get into a funk, well, this Friday during your thank you notes writing session, there's some great part of your life that you're going to acknowledge and kind of sit there.
100%. And it's actually why I say in the book, I try to be very understanding and very freeing, because I don't want anybody to read this book. I mean, it's designed as a blueprint for somebody to do what I did. But there's no thank you note, please. You don't have to write one letter a week. You could do one a month. You could do, whatever your pace is. I try anyway to be very just like you do you. But the one thing I do not compromise on is that you have to keep a copy of every letter you wrote. And the reason for that is exactly what you're saying, because at the end of the process, you have a physical stack of letters that is proof that you are loved. You have probably had problems before that some of these people have helped you through. That's why you're grateful to them. You have a support team. You are not alone. And this book came out right before the pandemic. I was on book tour for 3 months, and then all of a sudden everything switched to virtual. And of course, it was disappointing because I wanted to be out a bit more, but I also think it came out exactly at the right time because we were physically isolated from one another. And to have this methodology that would remind you, you're not alone. You feel alone, and that's because we're all, on lockdown, but there are people out there who you can think about who care so much about you, and you will be reconnected with them. And plus, who doesn't want to get an actual physical letter during the pandemic? Like, how nice to go to the mailbox and have something that isn't a bill. So I agree with that 100%. It's an interesting way to phrase it, but I was all about just like, I was going to grab it. It's actually over there. My little notebook. I still look at it all the time. I still will open it up when I'm having a low day and just reread a couple letters.
I notice a distinct change in my mindset and mood when I record this podcast, because I've been reaching out to like my old teachers, my old German teacher, my English teacher, and I'm compiling thank you notes to my speech and debate coach. But yeah, I feel a lot better when I'm doing this, and there's a permanent record on the internet of me thanking somebody, and that's something I can always go back to.
Well, and you're also, I mean, you have a science background, right? You're much more steeped in it, I think, than I am.
Technically, I am a physician.
Technically, your patients are hoping it's also really.
Yeah.
But what I was going to say is that what I learned is that all that gratitude, it rewires your brain, right? I mean, you're creating new synapses. You're making it more efficient to be grateful with each of those letters that you write. So, I think just over time, it's a practice. It's like a muscle, you work it out enough, it's going to get pretty strong, and you are going to continue. The nice thing is you continue to feel that with each letter. So I'm really glad that's been your experience. I laughed when you said German because if you've read the book, you know that, my first job was in Germany and I write about that. And then one of my friends who did this very early on wrote to her German teacher. I'm like, what is the German connection with I don't know what it is, but there's an affinity to gratitude, I guess.
I spent 2 summers in Germany, one in Munich and one in Berlin. And when I had my German teacher on this show, I wrote him a thank you note, and he wrote a thank you note to his high school German teacher.
Oh, I love that. And that happens. I mean, I know from people who have read this book and been kind enough to let me know that there's a ripple effect. And who doesn't need more gratitude in their life right now? I mean, who doesn't need to be told by somebody that you made a difference, especially and I love when it's a teacher or a doctor, people it's their job to teach us. It's their job to take care of us. But if you take a moment and think about what your life would be like if those people were not good at their jobs, there's a lot to be thankful for. And it's a nice moment to stop and think about that and acknowledge it.
Well, anybody can get up there and just regurgitate stuff out of a textbook, but these teachers actually took an interest in me and their students. And everything in my life I have to attribute me having those people in my life in my formative years.
That's awesome.
I did want to ask, did you ever consider making Thank You Notes a podcast?
No, I did not. Because as you mentioned, I was doing the Midlife Mixtape podcast. So initially I had a blog called Midlife Mixtape, and that eventually morphed into the podcast in 2015. I started doing that because I wanted to have people on the show. So my tagline for the blog and the podcast is for the years between being hip and breaking one. And it interested me, which has cursed me. I will have a broken hip someday. I know that. So that's just how it's going to be. But it interested me that so much at that time, I think it's changed over the past. It's changed over the past little while, but that time everything was about midlife crisis, and everything is so bad when you turn 40. And I was looking around at my friends who were doing really interesting things and creative things. And, of course, midlife is hard. Some of us lose our parents. There can be a lot of things that are really strained and stressful, but there are good things as well. And so it interested me to have guests on to talk about what they loved about being in midlife. And so I was doing that show every other week for 5 years. And I had the greatest grab bag of guests, from the Go-Go's Kathy Valentine to Outdoor Afro founder Rue Mapp, to this guy who specialized in animal policy and talked about how animals can help us in aging. And first of all, every episode started with this very important question, which I'll ask you right now, Travis. What was your first concert and what were the circumstances?
My very first concert was New Kids on the Block at Skelly Stadium in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And
how old?
I was in 5th grade. So let's say I was probably 10.
Sweet.
So my friend, Billy Sexauer, who's now a radio DJ, his mom camped out and got us tickets. And we went. It was my mom.
You owe her a thank you letter. You better write her a thank you letter.
That's a good point, actually. I wouldn't even know how to find it, but so we go to the it's me and my mom and Billy and his mom, and we're sitting up there. We go, and then my mom had enough. So when the encore break came, she's like, "We're going out of here." But it's like, but they haven't sang "Hangin' Tough" yet. It's like, we're going.
Yeah.
So as we were leaving, they played their big hit.
Kind of my feeling when I took my daughter to see One Direction 15 years ago. But so great story. It's my favorite opener. So those conversations really fun. I don't know what your experience has been, but mine was completely homegrown. I did it all myself. I loved it. I really like learning technology. So I did everything soup to nuts. And after 5 years and a pandemic, I was like, okay, that's enough time. Because I do have a day job. So it was a lot. So no, the thank you notes, the thank you project wisdom that I hope to impart is in a book. I also don't want to write a book about midlife. Everything I said about midlife is still available on every podcast platform. The Midlife Mixtape Podcast. Check out all 111 episodes. So
Okay, so you're not coming for my throne.
dear no,
okay.
Like I said, I left it all on the floor with the book. So
I wanted to ask you, what was the hardest thank you note you've had to write?
Let me preface this by saying I'm a pretty optimistic person even before thank you notes. And one of the I know a lot of writers. I took my manuscript out as an early draft to people who were as different as me as I could find, meaning introverts who had not been camp counselors, because I can talk to anybody. I'm very gregarious. And a few of my most introverted friends said, didn't it feel awkward? Didn't you feel vulnerable writing these thank you notes to people? What if you told somebody they'd change your life and they said, I don't even know who you are? And that was the first time it crossed my mind that somebody might feel that way. Cause I was like, no, everyone's going to love to get a thank you letter from me. And so I addressed that in the book, and I talked to a few people, and, we kind of talk about that issue because it was helpful to remember that there are people who might not approach it the same way. But that being said, I can't think of a letter that was too hard to write, aside maybe from explaining cell phones to Jane Austen, because if it was going to be that hard, I probably didn't write it. I didn't know anybody anything. Nobody does. I was just writing thank you notes to people in situations where I was grateful what I had learned from them. That doesn't mean that I learned everything from good examples. So this is where I'll get back to that idea of you can write the letters and not send them. When I realized that, I also realized, oh, I can write thank you notes to people who have been formative that I don't want to be in touch with, like a terrible boss I had, where after that situation, I said, I will never treat people like that. And I never have. So I wrote a thank you letter, but I didn't send that one. So I'm not saying that everything's, rainbows and puppies and everything's fine all the time, but if I was writing a thank you letter, it's because I felt it genuinely. I really was grateful for something. Like I said, didn't always mean I was going to send it to that person, but I knew that I had turned it into a positive experience somehow.
Mm-hmm. Some of the more serious ones, like the ones to your mom and your dad, you don't consider those like difficult to write? Because I ask because when I look at the list of people that I want to do on my thank you note project, there are some that where, number one, I don't know how to contain everything on the page, and there's some harsh truths and some good truth, and it's not the easiest place to sit in.
Yeah. Well, it's a really good question, Travis. I would say, first of all, start with the ones that are easier, because you can practice, get some experience under your belt writing them and creating those synapses, and kind of like, you don't have to start out with the hardest letters. And I had somebody at the launch event say, well, I have this very complicated relationship with my sister and da-da-da. I was like, put her at the end of the line. You don't want to do that right out of the gate. But I would say everybody can have their own opinion about this. But to me, these letters were not about settling a score. There are scores to be settled, I guess. Like in every relationship, there have been hurt feelings and unfairness, especially if it's a close relationship that's lasted a long time. In my case, I did not feel this was the place to resolve those. I have a friend who I met in ninth grade who is just, I've known her for so long. She's part of I just adore her. We just had dinner a couple nights ago. We are both from upstate New York, and somehow we both live in the Bay Area now. And we talked about the fact that in the 40 years we've known each other, 40 plus, we have had times when we didn't talk to each other. I'm talking about like 5 years at a time where we were just on different paths. And there was not a lot of goodwill at certain times, mostly when we were younger and kind of figuring ourselves out, I think. When I wrote a letter to her, I left all that out, because now, by the time I was writing this, we were in our 50s. I know now how valuable it is to have a friend who remembers my parents and they're at their peak, who remembers when I was learning how to drive and how I was better than her at it, and who remembers all this stuff that is so much more important than the fact that we didn't talk for the college years. Who cares about that? Whatever. We talk to each other now. We're so lucky to have each other in our lives now. So I would just say that spirit of these letters is to focus on the good. It's not to, and there may be people where that the good does not outweigh the bad stuff, in which case you don't have to write them a letter. They don't know. No, thank you, no, please. They don't know. So I would just encourage you to put those further down and just think about it more and see as you get further into the process whether you can find a different way to think about it or take them off the list. I mean, there were people I had on when I scrawled my first list out on, January 2016, there were some people as I got further through, I'm like, I don't think so, because I was like, oh, if I'm going to put this much time and effort into it and have it be authentic, I'm including them on the list because I think I have to. I don't have to. So, yeah.
I maybe I'm revealing too much of myself now, but I feel my feelings of indebtedness to some of these people. I'm like, I have to do that. Like it is my moral obligation to write this and let this person know how great they were and how formative they were to me. And I think you're coming at it about it from like a healthier standpoint. Like I'm sharing gratitude. I don't owe this person anything, but this is for, just to put good vibes out into the world. There's no debt or indebtedness or anything.
Yeah. I mean, you're walking a tricky line because you're doing a very public show about this. I was not writing a book when I wrote my letters. I was
True.
simply writing letters. So it's a different audience, I guess. But I would encourage you to, I mean, if you want to borrow my words, be my guest, help shaped, inspired. You know who helped me a lot? The guy who works at the market in my little neighborhood here in Oakland. That guy is like so kind. And if my wallet is, if I forget my wallet, he covers me. He knows it. Like that is somebody who actually has helped me in a concrete and meaningful way. The friend of a friend who I'm going to run into a party and she's nice to me all the time, but I don't know her like that. Like I really forced myself to think about like name the specifics. And then I talk about this in the book too, that it's important in these letters to use specifics. You can't say, oh, you're nice. It's like, you lent me your car one time when I had a job interview, or, you gave me money for something that covered a medical appointment, whatever it is, And so if you can't think of something really specific, I would wonder if that is a person
Right.
deserving that much of your energy. It doesn't mean you're not grateful to them somehow, but these letters are a bit of an investment of your time and energy. So I wouldn't feel obligated, but I say that knowing that I don't have a podcast that people are tuning into to see, like, did he? And I did have people at the reading come up to me at my readings to say, where's my letter? And I was like, that's why you didn't get one.
Oh, ooh.
I had it happen a couple times. I am a grown woman. I can put up with that kind of thing. I'm like, maybe be nicer. No, kidding. But,
Yeah.
And then there were people who got letters that I'm sure didn't expect them, but that was meaningful to me. So
I'm sure you've kind of become amongst your group of friends like, well, I sent Nancy a gift. There better be a thank you note coming. And my friends will like text me photos of their like, these are the thank you notes I'm sending for your gift or whatever. But the thing I 100% agree with you on is that a thank you note must be specific. It can't just be thanks for being so great. Thank you for helping me do this. Thank you for giving me this. Thank you for being a surrogate father or whatever.
Yeah. And I draw a little bit of a distinction between thank you notes, which I think is part of the grease of a civil society. I do think if someone goes out of their way to give you a gift, drop off a meal, something like that, just write them a thank you note. It doesn't have to be the kind of letters that you and I are talking about. It's a thank you note that says you went out of your way for me and I appreciate it and don't take it for granted. And those are 4 sentences. You're fine. Like, just get it in the mail. But the letters that we're talking about are much deeper and I think more personal because they're really about you, the writer. They're really about, I mean, if you think about it, and I think Seligman has done research on this, it's really about this idea of their action and then further than that, the impact on you. How are you a different person because of what they've done? And, you mentioned your teachers. I wrote, one of my letters was to my AP English teacher, Jean Cantori Green, Rochester, New York, Brighton High School. And she was an amazing, passionate, young, energetic, challenging teacher. And my family still lives where I came from. So I knew she was still teaching at the school and I was able to get a letter to her. But the thing that was amazing about her was she was so strict about writing. Everything you wrote, she would hand it back to you and say, good start. Now cut it by 2/3. So I learned to be very efficient with my writing. And then I went off and did a career in international business. I worked in the corporate world for 15, 20 years. And then at around 40, I decided, oh, I actually do want to be a writer. That's what I wanted to do the whole time. And I was able to get into it pretty quickly because I remembered all my Jean Green rules. I knew the basics. Yeah, so I'm totally lost the train of thought about why I'm talking about Jean Cantori Green, but I enjoyed, it was just so great to reflect back specifically. I could remember the poem you made us memorize, the Shakespearean dialogue, monologue we had to perform, and all this stuff is really specific to that class, that era. And I loved writing it because this is what it was. The fact that I got into her class is one of the reasons I have had some success as a writer. I did, modest, but thanks to her, I know my basics.
Would you ever write a follow-up thank you note? Like, would you ever write another thank you note to your dad? Like, if you go through a different stage of life and you say, hey, Dad, this happened today and now I understand this. Have you ever written a repeat?
Readers will know if you've read my book. The opening pages are about the fact that my dad passed away 6 months after I sent the thank you note to him. We did not know he had cancer and he passed away very quickly. And my mom has passed in the meantime as well. So to answer that specifically, I would say I talk to my mom and dad all the time. I mean, they're just with me. They ride along. So I would probably not do another thank you note to my parents because I feel like however this works, my mom and dad are with me all the time. So I have not done another bite of the apple, but if I were to do that, it would be the people who were very helpful to me during COVID. There were a lot of times during the pandemic where I felt like my friends showed up in an even bigger way. And, we all had to try to help each other during that period. And some of the stuff was just so over the top, the people who dropped off toilet paper when it was nowhere to be found, or, the people who came over and sat 12 feet away on the lawn. And, I feel like it's still a little too fresh to do that, but I could see myself for sure going back to my core group of people to do that for them. I tried to be as complete as possible back in 2016, but life will continue on. So hopefully I'll have more to write about at some point.
I will say I very much enjoyed reading the book, and it wasn't exactly what I thought it was going to be. I thought it was very, very scientific, but it was more personal to you than I thought it would be. And I very much enjoyed that. So thank you for writing it, and thank you for sharing it and spearheading the thank you note movement.
Well, I can't take credit for that. That's Seligman and Robert Davis and the Greater Good Science Center. They've all done tons of work. There's so many authors out there who have tried to, like I said, look at this through a different lens. And my lens is someone who had been blogging and writing a lot of personal essay for a long time. I just hoped that by giving some of my specific examples, people would say, well, I don't know Jean Cantori Green, but I know this other person, this other teacher that meant a lot to me. And I always think we learn best. That's why storytelling is important. You hear somebody's story and all its specifics, and you think I've got nothing in common with that person, except maybe I do, because we all kind of relate to one another that way, I think. So I hoped it would pull the reader in and make them think about how that worked in their own life. And I hope they would enjoy the mixtapes that were included with each chapter, because that was pretty critical. Yeah, that I spent at least as much time on as I did writing the book. So credit.
I could tell those were pretty carefully.
Oh, yeah. The editor finally said, no more edits to your mixtapes. They're going in as is, but people put out new music every day. And you're like, wait a minute, this song's perfect for the chapter about friends. So I got cut off.
Do you have Spotify playlists for those?
I do.
Okay.
If you go to my website, davisco.com, DAVISKHO.com, there is a link to the Spotify playlists for the book, which are now dreadfully out of date because I had to stop them in 2019. But,
All right, Nancy, I wrote you a thank you note. That's the way we do this. So
let's hear it.
Okay. And I don't know if you can see this, but I wrote this one and it was too long. So I took 2/3 out and I wrote you a smaller, more succinct one.
Oh, Mrs. Green will be so proud.
Dear Nancy, thank you for writing this wonderful book. While I was certain that my own project had been attempted before, I was pleased to see someone had accomplished it with real humor, heart, and personality. However, my favorite part of the book was getting to know you, your dad, your immediate family, and the lovely people you surround yourself with. What a treasure for them to know how much you appreciate them. Looking forward to more of your work. Thank you, Travis.
Travis, thank you so much. That's beautiful. And I feel very lucky to be surrounded by the people who I really hit a home run somehow. So
yeah, I very much enjoyed the parts about your dad. He sounded like a hell of a guy.
He was exactly that. He was a hell of a guy. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we miss him. He passed in 2016 and my mom passed in 2020. So we're just in that phase of life. But my brother has basically turned into my dad, so that makes it a little easier. And luckily we can all joke about that. And great grief goes along with great love. That's just how it works. So
are you turning into your mother?
Oh, yeah. I already am her genetic. Like, I look exactly like her. And I hope I turn into her because she was really funny and really nice. So that's the dream. I'm working on it.
Well, good.
I got to start going to the dollar store more often, I guess. That's going to be the main shift.
Okay.
So
have at it. Now, you've brought a thank you note to share with us, haven't you?
Yes, it's long. Do you want me to cut it by 2/3? I might edit as I go. So,
well, this is the thank you notes podcast. Your book is the thank you letters book.
Buckle up, people. So speaking of Germany, you asked me to bring the latest thank you note I wrote, and it has to do with my dad and it has to do with Germany. So this is one of the ones I wrote that I can't send because I do not know where this person lives. I've lost track with her, but it's pretty long. Really, should I go for the whole thing? You ready?
Just go for it.
All right. Liebe Petra, which I know you understand. Dear Petra, last time we saw each other in 1990, I was Nancy Davis, like Frau Reagan, as so many Germans expressed in astonishment when they met me. 33 years later, I'm Nancy Davis Coe, married 30 years and mom to 2 adult kids here in California. And I am still grateful to you all these years later for the friendliness you showed this immigrant American girl when she moved to Munich in 1988. So the short story is my dad worked for Kodak. He was the head of employee activities. One of his jobs was to take Kodak employees. This is obviously the golden days of the Kodak era. He would take employees on trips. He took a group of employees to Epcot Center in Florida, took me along and arranged for me to meet this German girl. And I was so mad because I was like 17. I did not want to hang out with this person I didn't know. She ended up being lovely. Fast forward 6 years, I moved to Germany for my first job. I'm 2 months into my new IT consulting job in Munich, and between loneliness and overwhelm, I'm completely losing my grip. My German never seems good enough. I have no friends outside the workplace because we work such long hours. The same reason I see no avenue to make friends. I'm seriously worried about my ability to stay in Germany, which was a long-held dream for this international business major. And then one afternoon, I thought, wait, wasn't that Epcot girl from Munich? I looked in the Munich phone book and voila, there you were. I called you. You responded like we were old friends who had just hadn't had a chance to get together for a minute. Okay, great. You said, I'm going to a birthday party this Saturday. I'll pick you up around 6. Do you remember that birthday party for Mark at his family's house filled with a whole ton of 20-something German friends of yours who simply accepted my party crashing without a protest and seemed to understand my German? Telling to myself, the main thing I remember is that they were impressed I kept up with them beer for beer and that Mark's dad cooked us all breakfast at 5 a.m. when our energy started to flag. For the remainder of my 2 years, you and Mark and the whole crew welcomed me along to all kinds of gatherings and beach trips and Stammtisch meetings. And do you know what Stammtisch is?
I do know what Stammtisch is. I went to the Tulsa one.
It's awesome. Everybody, all your friends meet at the same table at the same restaurant every week at the same time. It's like the best community thing you can do. It improved my life there in immeasurable ways and was part of why I stayed as long as I did. Your no-nonsense welcome set a standard, Petra, and I'm so grateful for your long-ago kindness. And it must be said for my dad engineering the whole thing. I wish I could track you down. I've tried to give you this letter, but I hope either way you somehow feel the ripples of appreciation flowing from me to you. And I hope that I always live up to the example you set when it comes to making someone feel included. So that's what I wrote to Petra Remiger. And if you know her, I can't find her. She was from Munich. Actually, she's from just outside, but it was one of those situations where she wasn't the first name that came to me. She wasn't the 50th name. It took even more time, but as you go through your life, and you are thinking about this kind of thing, I was like, you know what? I probably would have moved home from Germany way earlier, and I didn't want to do that. But Petra was just like, no worries, you're part of our club now. And that was a really important thing to me when I was 23.
Yeah, that's because that's a formative experience, stranger in a strange land. And you take every bit of kindness and help and friendship that you can get.
Yep. So that was my latest.
That was great. I enjoyed it. It reminded me a little bit of my time in Berlin.
Yeah, hopefully you had people like that too, who were kind to an immigrant and, it helped you feel at home. And I always say I would have definitely been a tax evader if it weren't for a couple of Germans who were like, girl, did you file your taxes? Because you need to. No.
I was in a high school exchange program, so I wasn't as on my own as you were. So I lived with a family with they had a boy who was about my age, and so he and I are still kind of in touch on Facebook.
That's cool. That's awesome.
All right. Now, as I said in my email, I normally spring a surprise question on my guests, but since I have the mixtape queen, I decided we should make a mixtape.
I'm ready for this.
This is going to be a 10-track mixtape. You're going to submit one, and I'm going to submit one. There's 5 categories.
Okay.
The first one is if you were a professional fighter, you would come out to this song.
Okay, you can see that I have it framed in my office. It's a song by Neil Finn, and it's called "She Will Have Her Way," and that is my psych up music. It's a great song. It's a great video. Everybody loves Neil Finn. He got one of my thank you letters.
That one was in the book, wasn't it?
Probably.
Okay.
I'm sure I would have, but I never miss a chance to recommend that song. What's yours?
Mine is "Hard to Handle" by Otis Redding.
Love it. It's going to be a weird segue, but go on.
Next one. You want this song to be played at your funeral.
So again, also Neil Finn. I actually have this on a playlist on my phone. It's called Funeral Songs, and it's just this song, which I'm hoping they will play on a loop. And it's called She Goes On.
She Goes On.
Mm-hmm. Owe it all to Frank Sinatra.
Okay.
So it's a very beautiful song that he wrote for his friend's mom when she passed.
I had a hard time with this one because do I want to go like ironic? Do I want to go funny? Or do I want to go sincere? And I went with "No Hard Feelings" by the Avett Brothers.
Oh, love that.
Mm-hmm.
That's a great one. That song, boy, did you see the documentary when he plays that at the very end?
Chills.
Yeah.
Next up, I have to give some background on this one. My daughter is 4 years old, and she went through a phase where she wanted to listen to female rockers.
Mm-hmm.
And so I went through everything that I knew, but I was like, I think there's 3 or 4 Liz Phair songs that are appropriate for a 4-year-old.
Just about.
Mm-hmm. And so going through her catalog, I started to remember how much I liked her. And you brought her up in the book as being a big fan. So number 3 is a favorite Liz Phair song.
Okay, I have a little background too, because as you probably know, Liz Phair just was on tour playing Exile in Guyville cover to cover, and it was the transcendent concert experience I had in 2023. She sounds and looks amazing, and it was just an audience of very happy Gen X women screaming along. So when you asked this question, of course, I immediately went to the 2 Not Safe for Work songs on the Exile in Guyville album, but then I thought, we've got a more general audience here. So actually, the song I'm going to say, the one I'm going to add to our mixtape is Somebody's Miracle. And the reason is because I love this idea. There goes somebody's miracle walking down the street is how the chorus goes. And what a much more wonderful world we would live in if we could all remember that as we are walking down the street, that every person we're passing is somebody's miracle. And we would probably treat each other with a lot more kindness if we could keep that in front of mind. So that is something that I think is a goal. Just remember that everybody is somebody's miracle.
I like that one. I was deciding between 2 and you made the decision for me. Mine is a Polyester Bride.
Yeah, of course.
I really like that one just because her music just seems really stream of consciousness, and she's having all these conflicting thoughts, and then she just puts it into a song, and it just seems to go really well together.
As you can imagine, that album was back on heavy rotation last year. I played a lot of Exile in Guyville.
Next up, song you were most looking forward to sharing with your children?
I don't have a good answer for this one. I'm not going to say I let my kids like develop their own music tastes unimpeded by me, because obviously we were playing music to them. My husband's a big music fan too. So, they're both really into Bruce Springs. My husband loves Bruce, and they both like Bruce Springsteen. The girls are 26 and 23 now, so mostly they're telling us about music. My older daughter took me to the Beyonce concert last year, which was awesome. What I keep coming up to is "I Am Superman" by REM, and it's not because I wanted them to hear it. It's that we had a family dance party once when the girls were tiny. We had like a baby and a toddler, and I just remember that song, that moment, our family just freaking out in the living room and everybody dancing around. And it was just like a joyous moment. And to me, that song is what I think of when I think of my kids being young and how music kind of brought our family together. That was just a kind of a beautiful parenting moment, because there's a lot, as we all know, there's a lot of moments that are not beautiful. So it's good to remember the ones that are.
Very true. The story behind mine is when my wife was pregnant, we went crib shopping and we were at Pottery Barn, and the song "Two of Us" by the Beatles came on, and I started to tear up in the middle of Pottery Barn. So I was very excited to share that song and the Beatles as a whole with my daughter, and she couldn't care less. But that's my song.
I was just going to say, is she a fan? Yeah, I don't give her some time. She's only 4. It'll come.
She's actually wearing a Beatles sweatshirt today, and she wears it a lot.
There you go.
All right. Last category, song that reminds you of your parents.
Easy peasy. It will always be a John Denver song, because my mom was a huge John Denver fan. And, I basically, any John Denver song reminds me of my parents, but probably Country Roads, just because that was, I write in the book about a family camp that we've gone to. My parents started taking us to back in the 60s. We still go, and it's out in the country. It's in the Adirondack Mountains. And that song to me is, I can cry in one note on that song. So what about you?
Mine, I had it between my mom and my dad. And since you went country, I'll go country too. My dad introduced us to "Asleep at the Wheel" at very little. And so they covered the song "Hot Rod Lincoln." We always thought that song was really funny.
I don't think I know that. All right. I'm going to go play Hot Rod Lincoln. I'm going to go find it.
Highly recommend. It's a cover of a cover of a cover. It's somebody, but it's a lot better when "Asleep at the Wheel" did it. But
that's a whacked out mixtape. We're going to have to find some kind of a unifying theme for that. We're going to have to throw in a couple more songs here and there to weave it all together.
I'm just going to embrace the oddity,
the chaos.
Just like you can write thank you notes to Jane Austen, your mom, and a high school teacher, you can have Neil Fenn, "Asleep at the Wheel," and Liz Phair on a cohesive mixtape.
Why not?
Mm-hmm. All right, Nancy, thank you so much for doing this. It's been an absolute delight.
Thank you so much. And I hope that, people will check out more of your podcast and get inspired, check out the book, get some writing tips about how to do this. And we'll just keep putting those gratitude ripples out into the world.
I agree. The links to the book and the podcast and Nancy's website will be in the show notes. And thank you for tuning in.
I want to give Nancy a big thank you again for being a guest on the show. Go to her website, davisco.com. The link will be in the show notes. And sign up for her newsletter. She'll keep you updated on everything she's doing. Follow her on Instagram, @midlifemixtape. I've made a Spotify playlist that'll link in the show notes. It's got all the songs that we selected for our playlist. And also on the show notes are my socials, TikTok, Instagram, LinkedIn. Please follow me there. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time.